All right, welcome everyone. I'm so excited to be here today recording our session for South by Southwest on Star Trek and real world space law. So it's not often that we get to spend our whole day geeking, or part of our day geeking out with fellow space policy nerds, although as I say that, probably pretty common for us maybe, but probably not under the filter of Star Trek and science fiction, right? My name is Elsbeth Magilton. I'm the executive director for the Space Law program at the University of Nebraska College of Law, as well as the Nebraska Governance and Technology Center, where we research the nexus between law and technology. And I'm so excited to be here with Gabriel and Catherine. And Gabriel, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thanks, Elsbeth. Yeah, absolutely. I'm really excited to have this conversation. Star Trek and space law are, of course, really near and dear to my heart, so it's incredible to have this opportunity to talk about the connections between them. I think we're going to find that there's a lot. Before we dive in, I guess I should introduce myself. My name is Gabriel Swinney, and I'm a space lawyer for the U.S. Department of State. So what that means is I somehow have pretty much the best job, I think, in the United States government. I get to work with diplomats, NASA, and other officials to interpret, apply, and negotiate international space law on behalf of the U.S. government. I should say that the views I'm expressing here are my own, and they don't necessarily represent the views of the United States, although I think it's fair to say that it's official U.S. policy that we like Star Trek, or at least if it's not official policy, it should be. So, Catherine, over to you.
Thanks, Gabriel. Like you, I'm super thrilled to be joining you and Elspeth for this chance to geek out about both policy and Star Trek. I'm pretty sure it doesn't actually get any better when it comes to a professional job. I'm Catherine Waldron, and I'm a fellow with the Cybersecurity and Emerging Threats team at the R Street Institute, which is a think tank here in DC. My team analyzes and comments on national security issues related to technology. The cyber threats to American assets in space is sort of an interest which I've been developing for a couple of years, policy-wise, but it's really not surprising because I've been a lifelong science fiction geek and happen to love Star Trek.
Awesome. So we have organized the session to really cover the breadth of what Star Trek and science fiction generally tend to explore. But before we get into that substance of space law and space issues, I think it might be useful to define science fiction and ask ourselves why it's relevant to examining policies and the ethics of how humans interact with space. This is to say that this is nerdy and fun, but it's also, I think, meaningful, right? And there's an important ideas that we're exploring here that go beyond just sort of the kitsch appeal. So if you're a sci-fi fan, you know that there's a lot of debate in defining the genre and in drawing distinctions between science fiction and fantasy. One of my favorite authors, Margaret Atwood, which I'm sure most people are familiar with at this point, has written on the subject, and I prefer her approach, which is that science fiction is what could be. And that is where it really breaks rank with fantasy, which tends to explore concepts that are outside of the realm of possibility, right? Magic and orcs and so on. But we have very real world examples of the types of technology that we see in science fiction, like flip phones and automatic doors, right? Straight from the Enterprise. So while some of the tech in science fiction might feel outlandish or even impossible, we have seen as a species our own technological capabilities grow exponentially in the last few centuries. So really nothing does feel that far-fetched on the Enterprise when we look at it through our lens of human experience. And I think that most people are a fan of both fantasy and science fiction, and both serve deeply important societal roles when it comes to storytelling. But so I'm not trying to pit them against each other, but I do think there's something particularly powerful in exploring what could be, right? Technology and human evolution make premises like Star Trek real, right? These are things that could happen. And I think that link to a possible reality is compelling and also forces viewers to reflect on their own current reality. And I think the how and the why of that really does impact how we approach evolving technology in space. The other feature of science fiction that I think might be useful to talk about to preface this conversation is that the setting and the tone is almost a character in a lot of science fiction. And by that, I mean that the spirit of exploration, of wonder, the interest in the unknown play as big a role as almost any other character in directing the story and creating an interesting piece of fiction. And this matters because those things like exploration and wonder and the interest in the unknown generate fear and they generate excitement. And those things motivate human decision making, right? And this is why science fiction serves as an effective exercise or even sort of almost mental role play as we think through future challenges. It's really a playground that we can use to explore the human condition and explore ethical quandaries and technical issues that we're going to face in the future. And so that's kind of the why of science fiction being important to this conversation. But so why Star Trek specifically? I have to admit, this session started with a project I did with our university library system relating research to pop culture. At the time, I narrowed down on Star Trek largely because it had a robust system of rules and organizations, and so it lended itself to a comparative law study. But I do think I was drawn to Star Trek for more than just that. It hits on the same tones and ideas of the general international liberal order, right? And it has a distinctly post World War II idealism. Uh, Roddenberry draws some obvious inspiration from the real world United Nations to the United Federation of Planets, right down to the charters both being signed in San Francisco. So Star Trek really felt like a natural fit. And I could go on that, but before I get further into comparing real world space law to Star Trek, I think we should probably define space law. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to actual space lawyer for the United States government, Gabriel.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the way you framed that, grounding our discussion in what could be, is a really good way to frame that. So I hope we get back to that as our conversation goes on. So I have the task of talking about the law, so we're all starting on a sort of a same page here. So to summarize, space law it's a whole thing, right? For starters, every country that has a space industry has their own laws about all kinds of topics relevant to space activities, right? So countries that launch rockets have rules relating to the safety of operations, and there are often detailed rules and regulations about a whole range of other topics. But that's not really what I want to focus on today. I think most of the connections, or maybe the most interesting connections to Star Trek, and these big picture ideas we want to talk about, really intersect most clearly with the international side of space law. So I'm just going to give a sort of a quick overview of that. On the international level, the best place to start is with a story at the beginning of human activities in space with the launch of the Sputnik 1 satellite by the Soviet Union in 1957. And I know we've all heard the story about how that launch surprised the world and kicked off the space race. But there's an aspect to that story that we just didn't know for many years because it was classified. When Sputnik orbited the Earth, it didn't just stay over the Soviet Union, of course, right? It was going on an orbit and passed across above many countries, including the United States. And Americans and others reacted with a real mix of emotions. There was an alarm, there was awe, there was wonder, but there was real fear too. And despite that, the U.S. administration, it was President Eisenhower at the time, and he didn't complain. The United States government didn't complain to the Soviets that there was a satellite floating around overhead. Members of Congress held hearings, they lambasted the president, pointed out that we would never have allowed the Soviets to fly an airplane across America or travel a ship through our waters without at least saying something. So what the heck were we doing about this satellite, right? What were we doing about Sputnik? And this is where the classified bit of the information, the formerly classified bit of information, comes in. What we know now is that this silence on the part of the Eisenhower administration was intentional. And they had in mind all sorts of cool and exciting science and security applications that you could do in outer space. And they actually wanted to establish the precedent that unlike airspace and unlike the ocean, you can go wherever you want in outer space, even if it means orbiting over someone else's territory. So with that precedent there, the failure to respond, the intentional silence with the launch of Sputnik, space law was born. The Cold War then went on, of course it continued, and it continued to provide real fertile ground for developing space law. The United States managed to get into space quickly after the Soviets, and other nations such as Great Britain were making strides and had large research programs as well. The Cold War itself was heating up, and both sides of that conflict came to realize that, as we move into outer space, we probably should have some rules about what you can and can't do beyond just it's okay to go to space and sort of float around wherever you want. So that effort took a long time. There's all kinds of interesting stories about negotiations in smoke-filled rooms at the United Nations. They were literally smoke-filled, right? Because you could smoke indoors back then, and the pictures I've seen are all kind of hazy, not just because they're old, but because I think the air itself was pretty hazy. But after a few years of effort, there was success in 1967 when the United States and the Soviet Union and a handful of other states signed the Outer Space Treaty, what we'll call the OST for short. That treaty is still in force and now has over 110 countries having joined it. So what does it say? Well, the good news for someone like me who has to live and work with it every day is that it's really short. It's about 7 pages long, but the OST really does provide a foundation for all international space law. It puts on paper that Sputnik precedent. It says that outer space can be free for exploration and use by all states, and that there's going to be free access by all nations to what they call celestial bodies. So that'd be the moon and planets and asteroids. The OST also says that outer space is not subject to national appropriation. So although you can go to the moon and plant your flag, that doesn't mean you own the moon. It means you can't own the moon, in fact. And OST says other things, like prohibits the stationing of weapons of mass destruction in space, and it says that the exploration and use of outer space shall be the province of all mankind. So, since the middle of the 20th century, zooming forward now, we haven't seen anything in space law on the scale of the Outer Space Treaty. That treaty is still the main sort of constitution of outer space, if you want to think about it that way. But we have made a lot of progress in space law, developing a body of principles and guidelines for all sorts of things, like the use of nuclear power in space and space sustainability. And most recently, just in the past year or so, I've had a really fun task in helping to nudge space law a couple steps further with the development of what we call the Artemis Accords, which is a declaration by a group of countries all working together in space, setting out agreed rules for implementing some key portions of the Outer Space Treaty as we move towards long-term operations on the moon and beyond. Okay, so everyone watching this knows enough now to sort of fake being a space lawyer at a cocktail party if you need to. And if we accomplish nothing else, I think that's something. But as far as Star Trek, I do want to make a few observations, and maybe we can dive into some of these a little bit more. The first one is peace, right? There's plenty of conflict in Star Trek, of course, and plenty of military and political uses of outer space here in the real world. But at the heart of both Star Trek and the Outer Space Treaty is the idea that even in the midst of conflict, whether it's the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, or the war between the Federation and the Klingon Empire, we should always be moving towards peace. I think Catherine's going to talk about this a little more later, so I'll just leave that thought there for now. The second parallel I see is a strong emphasis on science and exploration. Right? The Enterprise has weapons, but it's a science vessel on a mission to explore strange new worlds, as it says. And that same emphasis on exploration is in the very first article of the Outer Space Treaty. Third, space can inspire us to cooperate. Right? The Federation of Planets in Star Trek is this huge cooperative undertaking by a bunch of different species. And we actually have our own little miniature version of that today in activities like the International Space Station, which involves hardware and astronauts and ground stations and engineers from all over the world. And that cooperation is underpinned by international agreements and international law that sets out how we can work together. Space can be inspiring, I think, and also, frankly, because it's really difficult to operate in space. So it brings us together, both out of that sense of inspiration and sometimes out of necessity. And finally, the last observation I'll make right now is that when we expand into space, we bring our values with us. Right? The Federation, as you said at the very beginning, in Star Trek, it's incredibly diverse, but one thing its members share is a commitment to what we could maybe call a small L liberal values. And as we negotiate new space law instruments like the Artemis Accords and future agreements, as we sort of move permanently or semi-permanently into outer space, we're at least trying to bring some of our own values into the solar system and using international law and international space law as a tool to do that. So I'll stop now and hand it over to you again, Elspeth.
Yeah, so I want to expand on this a little bit more, kind of beyond the functional operations in space or how law applies in space, and focus on that value that you're talking about, our values in space as a species, as a country, in many different ways. And I want to think about how we view mutual access to space. Catherine, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, so thanks, Elspeth. So when the Outer Space Treaty was first created in 1967, space was a lot simpler in some ways. You know, you only had two spacefaring nations who were, albeit at war with one another, and the main concern was preventing space from becoming nuclear. Today, space looks a lot different. There are actually 13 spacefaring nations now, although only China, Russia, and the US are the only countries that have actually sent manned crewed flights into space. But even countries that aren't spacefaring are still reliant on space-based technology, like satellites. And there's a quickly growing private sector that's actually interested in space, known as New Space. Just about everyone has heard about SpaceX and Blue Origin, but these are actually only two companies in what's an exploding new market. So space is kind of getting crowded. And why is everyone so interested in space? Well, there's a lot of reasons. Scientific exploration, natural resources, the use of satellites and other artificial devices to help with things like communications, navigation. Star Trek calls space, the province of all mankind, and as more people than ever before have access to space, that's something that's actually just beginning to actually be true. Of course, as Gabe has talked about, with access to space comes the need for additional rules and agreements on norms to govern how we're going to interact with one another up there. And that's something that we have to figure out as we go along. So some of the rules of the road have been created because we've got the Outer Space Treaty, but the more and more people who are interested in space, the more norms and rules we're going to have to figure out. We're going to have to see whose values win out, essentially. We have some of them. We don't. We have the Outer Space Treaty, so we're avoiding, weapons of mass destruction floating above our head, and we're not going to colonize the moon. In our world, these rules stem from the Outer Space Treaty, but in Star Trek, we have something very similar, which is the Prime Directive, which prohibits Starfleet starships from interfering with the development of alien life or society. And I find Star Trek's Prime Directive really fascinating because it immediately establishes a sense of the Federation's value and their respect for essentially property rights. These are self-imposed limitations that are completely contrary to actually what we might expect of the Federation. You have a technologically advanced society, which has the ability to travel to the far reaches of space and has the firepower to put up a pretty good fight. The Federation would make excellent violent colonizers if they were so inclined, and if they were to take their cue from the majority of superpowers throughout history, that's what they would be. But because the Prime Directive actually prohibits interference in a society's cultural evolution, given that they're below a certain level of development, it also prohibits violently colonizing inhabited planets for the sake of plundering resources. In the eyes of the Federation, inhabited planets generally belong to their residents. Now, the characters on Star Trek, as anyone who's seen the show will know, act against the orders of Starfleet and violate the Prime Directive all the time. And even Starfleet itself fails to live up to its own ideals on occasion. A prime example of that comes from Star Trek Insurrection, where the crew of the Enterprise protest and prevent another faction of Starfleet from forcing a group of people, the Baku, from being relocated against their will. And then obviously groups outside of Starfleet and the Federation don't necessarily hold the same values. Still, it's fascinating to see Starfleet willing to implement limitations on themselves. And I think this is partially because Star Trek is set in what's considered a generally post-scarcity world. So poverty in the Federation has been eliminated, and most necessary goods are created by machines called replicators. But there's still some natural resources in the Star Trek universe that can't be created through the replicators, notably dilithium crystals, which are necessary for powering starships, and at least in the original series, couldn't be created by replicators. And as a result of this, when the Federation wants to mine dilithium or other rare minerals, they either have to petition, and those minerals are on an inhabited planet that's not in the Federation, they have to petition the planet's inhabitants, sometimes successfully, but sometimes unsuccessfully. Or in some cases, forego mining altogether, presumably, in cases where they aren't allowed to contact the alien culture. And I bring up the issue of property rights because this is one of those many areas in our world where the rules and values are still actually being worked out. So we've addressed property rights regarding the moon. No one's allowed to colonize the moon under the Outer Space Treaty. But there are other bodies in space that have natural resources, and people want to take advantage of that. We don't have the capacity yet, but there's been theoretical discussion about what it might be like to mine asteroids or comets or other bodies that have natural resources in abundance. And we're going to have to establish norms and values and rules that determine who is allowed to do what where in space. I know we're going to discuss in a moment what happens when we don't agree on the rules and we don't follow them. But first, I want to ask you to a couple questions. So, the Outer Space Treaty and Star Trek's Prime Directive both kind of provide rules for governing conduct in space. Elspeth, just how similar in your mind are the Federation and the United Nations when it comes to their vision for space?
So first, I am really glad that to not tackle the appropriation question first, and not be responsible for talking about how maybe the American perspective of that might be different from the rest of the world's perspective on that. But when it comes to the Federation and United Nations, I think we have some really fun like callbacks that Roddenberry put in there. Like I mentioned, the charters being signed in San Francisco. The crests are really, really similar. So there's some really clear honoring almost of the United Nations and the similarities between this idea and this celebration of cooperation. But I also think that besides those callbacks, we also see similar themes. And this is to say that there is an ideal that space ought to be preserved for all, but that access is maybe more of an individual endeavor. So while there's room for cooperation, and as Gabriel, excuse me, we see significant cooperation in space, and space lends itself to that because it's so expensive to operate in space. It simply makes sense to cooperate. But I don't know that necessarily our legal frameworks are what's promoting that cooperation so much as the expense of operating in space. And I don't think that they discourage it, but are relatively neutral on that. It's not, we don't say to other countries, here's the technology, here's the funding, everyone should have access to space. It's more the ideal that people should be allowed to develop their technology and their own journey to space. And there's room for cooperation in that, should there be individual interest in that space. And I think that kind of mirrors this idea of the Prime Directive, right? Which is that access to space, and in Star Trek's cases, species access to space, is sort of about finding their own journey there and not making the assumption that there's one right way to use and access space. So to me, it's similar themes, and of course some of the wonderful callbacks. And rather than deep diving into like the nitty gritty of the actual language that's out there in the extended Star Trek universe, I think those themes are probably the more compelling part of the conversation.
So, one other thing that Star Trek doesn't really address is the private sector. We know that in the Star Trek universe, there are at least a few private businesses. For example, the Picard family has a vineyard, which has supposedly been passed down through their family for generations. And there's a few glimpses and mentions of mining companies. But in general, when it comes to Star Trek, government is the main players. And I'd love both your thoughts on how major an oversight do you think this is on the part of Star Trek? Given today's emerging new space market, would you say that new space is bringing us closer or farther from Star Trek's utopian future?
So first, I don't know that we can confirm or deny that Boeing didn't design that bridge and sell it to the Federation, right? Like we don't 100% know that defense contractors or aerospace contractors aren't a part of the equation. But yeah, generally, I think you're right. We are to assume that this is all government funded. I do think in the expanded universe, maybe Deep Space Nine had some plots about smugglers and arm trades and those sorts of things. So I think it's safe to assume there is some private defense/security market in this imagined world. But I think that's really a callback and a reflection to that post-World War II idealism again, right? That this cooperation of governments is absolutely fundamental to our security and a real belief in that.
Gabe, I know you've been involved in helping with the establishment of the Artemis Accords and the development of space law. What successful models outside of the Outer Space Treaty are there for regulating activities in space, or really bringing those norms and values that we care about with space to space with us?
What we've seen over the past few years in particular is that you're absolutely right, that a more flexible reactive bottom-up approach to space law and space policy is what where sort of the center of gravity has been for the past, I don't know, 10 or 20 years. And I think that's driven by largely the rise of new space companies, right? That's one thing so we have an incredible diversity of actors in outer space, not just within the United States, but also globally. You also see expanded operations in countries around the world, so you have an increased government role as well. So because things are happening so quickly, and because we're doing more and more complicated things in outer space, creating big new overarching treaties may not be quick enough or reactive enough or flexible enough. So what we've really tried to emphasize is the development of sort of bottom-up best practices that build on the experiences of companies, private sector, NASA, and other space agencies, as well as small and flexible coalitions of countries that are working together to do particular things, like go to the moon and explore under NASA's Artemis program that has big international participation and was the sort of inspiration for the Artemis Accords themselves. And I think that's exactly the kind of thing you see possible within the Federation, right? We talked about already how the Federation does have its own perspective. It has this post-scarcity mindset. It doesn't really use money that much within the Federation itself. But at the same time, there's this incredible diversity of worlds in the galaxy and in the sector within the Star Trek universe. Right? Each one of those worlds is allowed to sort of develop themselves as they wish, right? There's vacation worlds, and there's industrial worlds, and there's the Ferengi out there running around being super capitalist. So I think that sort of flexible approach to expansion into space is not only reflected in what we're doing now, but it does exist in Star Trek as well if you step a little bit further back from the Federation itself.
Yeah, so as we look to the future, there's a lot of areas where these norms and values and rules and regulations are all going to need to be developed. And one area that occurs to me is that's in the process of being developed is how do we handle space debris? So old satellites that are now defunct or pieces of rockets that are just out floating in orbit. And there's obviously work to be done in determining who's responsible for cleaning up space and when that needs to occur. But I'm curious what other spaces you two see as opportunities for international cooperation or conflict.
I think we could pivot back to the appropriation question and thinking about resources that might be on other celestial bodies, such as asteroids, right? So, that's a very difficult technology to do something like that, like to mine something that's in orbit. Or that moving through space. And so those things are always ripe for cooperation as you pool resources. Although we see a lot of private sector companies that are very interested in doing that who maybe are not cooperating, right? Because there's also lots of money to be made. So it's ripe for conflict. And the question of what you do with those types of resources, if this is successfully done and it comes back, some of those resources would be in a position to basically slaughter our economic model, right, in terms of trade and the value of things like platinum or other types of minerals. So while they're ripe for collaboration and cooperation, I also see, the flip side of that same coin really is conflict. That's one example that immediately came to me. Gabriel, do you have another to put you on the spot?
Yeah, no, I'll suggest something that's a little more hopeful, perhaps, than resource wars. As we do more sustained operations in outer space, particularly in places like the moon, Mars, asteroids, I think we're going to need to change the way we've done things in the past. And what I mean by that is previous activities in outer space, you typically have one actor or an actor with a group of their sort of closest partners going up and doing a thing, right? The Apollo program is a great example of that. The United States doing things on the moon, and then they stop, and that thing is over. That's not how it's going to be anymore, right? If we have sustained operations on the moon, for example, you're going to have multiple countries, multiple private sectors doing things. And I suppose there's no reason, and sort of technical reason, why they couldn't each go off and do their own thing on the moon. But that's incredibly wasteful, right? That's inefficient, it's dumb, it's probably duplicative. For example, not everyone needs to build their own landing pad. They don't all need to build fuel tanks. They don't all need to build solar cell farms. So I think an area that's really ripe for increased cooperation is infrastructure development. That's not very sexy. Maybe it's a little bit boring, right? But when you think in your own mind, like, okay, globally or within our own countries, what do we look to governments to do? Well, we look to them to do things like build an air traffic control system and build roads and regulate shipping, right? All this kind of infrastructure stuff that makes the world work together. Things that no single entity could successfully do on their own. So I think that kind of area, this infrastructure, space infrastructure development, is really ripe for international cooperation.
Gabriel, I have to say, one of the jokes I often make about the students that we have that come in who are so excited, enthusiastic about space law is that the legal educational process takes something that's really sexy and exciting and makes it very boring. So part of our job at the law school is to get into the nitty gritty of the law. I love that. Catherine,
That's
I have a
right.
question for you. You know, you've mentioned conflict in a few different capacities here. Um, and clearly that's a big part of what you research and study in your job as well. Um, so building on that, you know, those are major themes in Star Trek, as you mentioned, and definitely I think something on the mind of most people working in space right now, or even just thinking about space. Can you talk a little bit more about the vision of conflict in space, where it stands in the real world, and how it's approached in Star Trek?
Absolutely. Though first I would like to say I feel very sorry for all your students, and I feel like you should require them to watch a certain number of Star Trek episodes, like for every class, in order to like regain that sense of wonder and sexiness about space.
I promise it loops
Um,
back to fun, but we have to teach contract procurement at some point.
there. But to go to conflict, Star Trek is often known as being the hopeful vision of the future and of the human race and what we can achieve. So I find it very interesting then that despite a fairly optimistic view of cooperation in space, Star Trek doesn't actually shy away from the reality that there's going to be conflict in space. Often the show focuses on conflict in one of two ways: mediation and engagement. The first is certainly born from Star Trek's more hopeful view of humanity. In several episodes, Starfleet members serve as mediators between two conflicting sides and are actually able to bring conflicts to an end. But the other major exploration of conflict, of course, is by showing the Federation's interactions with the more long standing enemies they have. And throughout the different series, we see a number of different groups who engage in violent conflict, often border skirmishes, with the Federation. Klingons, Romulans, Cardassians, the Dominion, just to name a few of the more famous ones. Even here, the relationships aren't necessarily set in stone. Gabe, you mentioned that Star Trek is always about moving towards peace. And I think that's generally true. The Federation is all about soft power and diplomacy, which is why Starfleet is so often called in to mediate local conflicts. And some of the groups that are initially introduced on the show as villains, such as Klingons, eventually become allies. But we also see that the Federation's diplomacy has limits. Some enemies, like the Borg, a cybernetic hive mind who wants to assimilate every species they come across, they have goals that are just too antithetical to the Federation's love of diplomacy and who have to be avoided or contained. Individuals can be saved. Star Trek shows several characters who are de assimilated from the Borg, such as Voyager's Seven of Nine. But the threat of the Borg isn't resolved peacefully. Star Trek also shows the difficulty eradicating violence and conflict from space and predicts some of the ways that that conflict of the future looks different from conflict of the past. Um, One aspect is the prevalence of dual use technology and organization and resources. Dual use is when a resource or piece of technology has both a military and a peaceful application. And Starfleet plays many roles for the Federation, including scientific exploration, diplomatic missions, but it also serves occasionally as military defense. Member of Starfleet carry hand phasers, which can be set to stun, but they can also be set to kill. Starfleet ships carry plasma cannons and phase cannons. Starfleet exists for scientific exploration, but it does it armed. And so all these resources and technology that keep Starfleet running have a potential military application. Dual use technology and resources are also becoming increasingly prevalent in our world thanks to technology and innovation. Why does the military care about space? Well, putting satellites in space allow for communication, navigation, helping with timing services, environmental monitoring, space-based intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. Um, but the private sector actually has an interest in a lot of those too. GPS is a perfect example of that. It's useful to the military, but it's also useful to you. And dual use technology, that prevalence raises some interesting questions that actually come up a lot in cyber policy, um, because dual use often makes things kind of blurry. It makes you ask questions such as, what counts as an acceptable target? And how do we distinguish what actually counts as an act of war or not? For example, if malicious actors hack a satellite's ground station or they jam frequencies so as to disrupt communications, which are things that have happened, how should we respond? Do we immediately need to go to war, or is this something where we can respond in a different way that may not necessarily lead to straight up conflict? And it's true that we have the Outer Space Treaty, but the OST doesn't actually necessarily prevent an attack on a space-based asset or prevent all types of weapons from being sent into space. So the norms of grayscale conflict involving satellites and space-based assets are one of those areas that's really still being developed. Another area of conflict that Star Trek talks about is fighting over resources. We all knew this was coming. The idea of wars being fought over resources is not new. You only need to do a quick look at a history textbook to see that resources have always been a major incentive for conflict. But what makes this so interesting is that Star Trek's utopian vision is based on a primarily post-scarcity world. Now, as someone with an academic background in economics, I have a lot of questions about how exactly that works in regards to the allocation of goods and resources, but still. As I mentioned before, Star Trek is a world where replicators can make just about anything you want, provide certainly anything you need for normal survival. Yet we still see different groups fighting one another for control of resources and planets. One example of that is the Cardassian occupation of Bajor, home of Star Trek character Ensign Ro. Bajor is invaded by the much more martial Cardassians, who then enslave many of the Bajorans and force them to work in their mines. But Bajorans who escape the Cardassians are forced to live as refugees until the Federation eventually helps step in. Finally, the third aspect of war and conflict I want to touch on just briefly, because I know I've been talking a bit, is ideology and culture. So the Federation works in Star Trek because people buy in to those values and those ideals, including the focus on diplomacy and peace. But there are other cultures outside the Federation who have very different values and who actually, in some cases, prize conflict. Klingons were first introduced to Star Trek as an extremely materialistic, war-focused group, but though their culture was later moderated a bit to reflect more of a noble sense of honor and being a warrior. The Romulans were also introduced as very martial, having established an interstellar empire. And while the Federation has a lot of cultural diversity within, not all of the political ideologies that they meet are actually consistent with the Federation's aims. So one question I have is, despite being a very forward-looking show, a lot of Star Trek's foundational ideology and their values actually come from when it was created, which was the Cold War and the Vietnam War specifically. So the Prime Directive can be seen by some as a rebuttal to U.S. engagement in Vietnam. In the original series, the Klingons and the Federation are actually locked into a Cold War of their own. Given the show's focus on commenting on the events of the day, I think it's interesting to ask, is Star Trek still relevant actually in predicting, I mean, obviously, I think yes, but in predicting what war is going to look like in the future? Where are the limits of that?
My gut reaction to that is I think yes too, but primarily in the reflection of the ongoing kind of power dynamics, right? And particularly how space signals power between countries, right? To operate in space, and of course, when we're talking in the Star Trek universe, we're talking between planets or a federation. Here in the real world, we're talking about global dynamics between countries. But being able to operate in space shows that you have a lot of human capital and technical expertise, which means you probably have an educational system. It signals how much money you have, how many resources you have, because it's just so difficult to create these types of space programs. And so in terms of Star Trek being reflective of the same sort of power dynamics and the same differences of idealism that we see in our real world, I think absolutely. On the flip side, I also, in the last year, got a call from a local reporter who asked me how the government was planning to make Marines' guns work in space, right? When the when Space Force was announced. And trying to, and so there's also, I think, this interpretation of watching some science fiction that it's, pew pew, and that there's going to be lots of lasers and that type of warfare. And I don't know that I would dare to venture quite that far into saying that I think future war looks like how kinetic fighting is happening in shows like Star Trek.
That's right. Yeah, Star Trek is not a good model if you want to think through the physics and engineering of how war will be fought in space. That part's not realistic. But what it has done, I think, and what science fiction does in general, is holds a mirror up to the society in which it's created. Right? You said that Star Trek was founded sort of around the Vietnam War and reflects a lot of that, and that's absolutely true. But as Star Trek has moved on from the original series, we've seen Next Generation and Deep Space Nine and Voyager, and now we have Star Trek Discovery. And I was just thinking as you were talking, the premise of the latest season of Star Trek Discovery is this sort of far, far future, even for Star Trek, where much of the dilithium that powers their ships no longer works. Right. So you have what was a former sort of dominant power dealing with a situation where they have a serious energy crunch, essentially. And I think there's real lessons to be learned there, or at least explored, for example, in a climate change kind of world for ourselves, right? Where the ways we get and use energy create constraints in a way that we maybe weren't used to for most of the 20th century. So I think Star Trek has at least tried, and sometimes more successfully or less, to update the way it views the geopolitics of its universe and sort of the big picture challenges to reflect the motivators of our own society as well. And so I think when it comes to the motivations for war and how the politics like that work out, I do think it's still very, very relevant.
I think you're definitely right that because Star Trek is such a long-running series and has actually so many series within its broader franchise, we've actually seen it take a variety of different approaches. Like watching an episode of Discovery is going to look different from watching an episode of Next Generation, which will look different from the original series for sure. So there's a lot of concern you guys mentioned about conflict in space, and obviously now we have Space Force. And then there's been a lot of discussion about the weaponization and militarization of space. Is there a difference between those two phrases, and does that actually matter? Should we be concerned about this?
I think there's a significant difference between those two. I think that everyone here would agree with me on that. In terms of militarization in space, or military operation and interest in space, that's as old as our space program, right? The same time that Congress was creating NASA and giving them their charge, they were giving the U.S. Air Force the capability to operate in space and appropriating funds for that. So the idea that the military is interested in operating in space from a security perspective is not a new consideration. What that looks like and what their capabilities in space are and should be, I think, is still a really relevant question, and one that I think a lot of countries, including the US, are grappling with. But I do think that there's an important distinction between putting weapons in space and military operations in space. And Catherine, it calls back to what you were talking about earlier. This is so hard to talk about in space because of that dual use nature of pretty much all space assets, right? When is that robot that is servicing a satellite to prolong its life and decrease space debris and increase sustainability also something that can be used on an adversary to take down their satellite or do nefarious things? So I think the dual use nature of this makes this really difficult to delineate in space, but I do still think that there's an important distinction between weaponization and militarization.
I think that's right. I'm trying to think through how to frame this in terms of Star Trek. Um, so Star Trek has the benefit of being set in the future, right? So we sort of see the end state, or at least one possible end state in the Star Trek world, where, as you say, diplomacy and mediation is at least how they try to solve large-scale conflicts, and they're pretty successful at doing that. Not always, but most or much of the time. And I think that makes sense for a interstellar civilization. I think you're either going to do that, you're either going to be able to solve most of your conflicts peacefully in the end, or you're going to wipe each other out, right? The ability to go to space, as you've both said many times, is inherently dual use. The level of energy involved, just the fact of being above a gravity well, at the top of a gravity well when you're in orbit, right? There's incredible destructive potential that is absolutely inherent in space capabilities. That's why there's so much dual use. Right, and that's why countries like the United States get concerned, for example, when countries like North Korea develop a satellite launch vehicle. Right, there's nothing wrong with having a satellite nothing wrong with having a satellite launch vehicle in sort of conceptual terms, but if you can launch a satellite, you can launch an ICBM, right? So I think if that has to be the goal, otherwise we're just going to wipe each other out, given the levels of energy and power and technological capability involved. The problem is we're at the beginning of that journey, right? Star Trek's already done it. They've succeeded. I think if you go in deep into the Star Trek lore, they actually hint at some pretty devastating wars on Earth before they sort of achieved their utopian society. So I do think Star Trek shows the path. Unfortunately, they skipped the hard stuff, right? They skipped the how do you get there part. And that's the part we're going to have to muddle through, and where maybe other science fiction is going to have to give us some guidance.
All right, so this has just been so much fun, but we unfortunately have to start wrapping up our session today. But I think we still have one question that we have to answer, and it's the question that we posed in our very own session description, so we'd be remiss to not get to it. So, Catherine, let's start with you. Are we as optimistic as Gene Roddenberry?
So I think personally, I'm not quite as optimistic as Roddenberry, but I'm not necessarily sure that's a bad thing. I think one of the reasons we have science fiction is to show us the possibilities, and so having something that aims super high, that like says humanity can achieve all these wonderful things. We can use diplomacy. We can be peaceful. Is a good thing to have. It's aspirational, but that's not a bad thing. And the fact that we may not ever achieve that doesn't mean that having that goal posed out in front of us, something to strive for, is bad. It doesn't mean that it's a failure on the part of Star Trek.
It's a tough standard to meet because Star Trek is it's almost utopian in so many ways. But I do think there's some clear parallels and some lessons we can draw. There's the famous story about Gene Roddenberry telling his writers and producers that there should be no significant conflict within Starfleet. And so humanity and our allies had essentially solved all their social and economic challenges. And the challenges Captain Kirk and his crew faced were pretty much entirely external, right? They were dangerous natural phenomenon or Klingons or someone like that. So in that sense, no, we aren't as optimistic as Roddenberry. And I don't think any of us would claim that humanity is close to solving our internal conflicts. But that said, Klingons aren't real, right? And it was clear from the very beginning, as we've said before, beginning of Star Trek, that adversaries in Star Trek are at least partially stand-ins for human countries and belief systems. So we've seen that reflected in every series, from the original crew to today. So if we take a step back from the Federation itself and look at the broader relationships between Star Trek factions, right, all the different species, I think we really do see something that looks much more like the world we live in now. So there's conflict, yes, in Star Trek, but there's also people pushing progress forward, whether they're Klingons or Vulcans or Romulans or whatever. So by using those alien stand-ins for the problems we face in the real world, Star Trek is I think, doing something really clever. Two things at once, in fact. The broader Star Trek universe shows us a reflection of ourselves as we are, and the Federation shows us what we could become. So I guess I'll just end with a personal observation that, at least in my mind, brings this together. I'm a lifetime space nerd. I went to Star Trek conventions. I went to space camp. But I also really love the law, and I love the slog and work of international diplomacy. And for me, at least, those two loves, the space and the law side of myself, are not different, right? They're really two ways of approaching the same question, which is, can we make the world better? Star Trek says yes. And the real world tools we use to do that are law and diplomacy and economics, right? That's how we make the Star Trek vision real. We might fail, but is there reason to be as optimistic as Star Trek? Absolutely. I think there is.
I want to thank both of you for going on this ridiculous adventure. We started back in 2019, which feels like it was 45 years ago. We got canceled in 2020 and finally happened today. So I hope in the future we all get to meet in Austin and nerd out in person, but this was an excellent and very fun substitute. I know we want to also thank everyone who voted for this session in the South by Southwest panel picker and the organizers of South by Southwest for having us. So thank you, everyone.